Hi, fourth graders. So I just finished chapter 4, and you just listened to chapter 4, hopefully. So now I'm going to read chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about the same length, but before I move on to chapter 5, we can talk a little bit about chapter 4 and what that meant. So, Camp Green Lake, what they were really trying to tell you about Camp Green Lake in chapter 4 is that it's all dirt. It's really dry and it's in deep Texas, which is pretty far south, and it's really hot. So there's a bunch of dirt where the lake should be. There's no lake. There's a lot of dirt. There are holes everywhere. And then that leads me to my next question. What's Stanley's job? Stanley's job is to dig a hole every day. The hole has to be 5 feet deep. So he has to dig a hole in the ground that's 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in every angle. So he has to make a big hole. Think of a 5-foot person. So that 5-foot person has to stand in the hole and has to be able to lay across the hole. And he says, use your shovel to measure it. So he's digging holes every day. He gets to start really early in the morning, and then the rest of the day is his. And then Mr. Sir also said, you'll be buzzard food. Well, Camp Green Lake is the only place that has water for 100 miles. So if you run away, he probably won't be able to get very far because he won't have enough water to go anywhere. So when he says you'll be buzzard food, it probably means he's going to die before he gets somewhere else. So they're not really worried about campers running away. When I'm reading this chapter, a couple words that you need to know. Sanitary. Sanitary just means clean. So if something is sanitary, it's clean. You know, it's not dirty or has a lot of bacteria. Then there's canteen. So he got his clothes, he got his jumpsuit, and he got a canteen. And a canteen is just something, it's kind of like a water bottle, but it's something that people who go camping, it's supposed to hold a lot of water. All right, so as you're reading, I want you to think about the new characters that we're meeting and how Stanley's feeling. So, without further ado, chapter 5. There were 6 large gray tents, and each one had a black letter on it, A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselors slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendanski was his counselor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Pendanski as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words. Pen, dance, key. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald, but his face was covered in a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir ain't really so bad, said Mr. Pendanski. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendanski said. I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell the counselor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendanski to think that he has a bad attitude. I'm going to help you turn your life around, and said his counselor, but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on you to help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said, good, and patted Stanley on the back. Two boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called to them, "Rex, Alan, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team." The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other was black. "What happened to Barf Bag?" asked the black kid. "Lewis is still in the hospital," said Mr. Pendanski. He won't be returning." He told the boys to come in and shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves, like gentlemen. "Hi," the white kid grunted. "That's Alan," said Mr. Pendanski. "My name's not Alan," the boy said. "It's Squid, and that's X-Ray." "Hey," said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Pendanski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led them inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from the next one to it. "Which was Lewis's cot?" Mr. Pendanski asked. "Barf Bag slept here," said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. "All right, Stanley, that'll be yours," said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and a towel in what used to be Barf Bag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendanski as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. "They all have nicknames," explained Mr. Pendanski. "However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return to become useful and hard-working members of society." "I ain't just a nickname," X-Ray told Mr. Pendanski. He tapped the rim of his glasses. "I can see inside you, Mom. You've got a big, fat heart." The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendanski and X-Ray called him Zero. "You know why his name's Zero?" asked Mr. Pendanski. "Because there's nothing inside his head." He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. "And that's Mom," a boy said. Mr. Pendanski smiled at him. "If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom." He turned to Stanley. "If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm dependent on you." Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once," said Mr. Pendanski, "and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley." Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendanski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty, he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. "Hey, Theodore," he said, going after him. "Do you know where I can fill my canteen?" Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. "My name's not Theodore," he said. "It's Armpit." He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. "There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall." "Thanks, Armpit," said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, He couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by somebody named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. So, a lot going on in that chapter, but the 3 questions I want you to answer is, who is Mr. Pendanski? Why do you think the campers give each other those nicknames? And how do you think Stanley is feeling right now? So you will answer those questions in the Padlet that I'm going to share. You just click the plus sign and type your answers. And next week we will come back with chapter 6. If not, chapter 6 and 7. But chapter 7 is pretty long, so we'll see. All right. Bye, 4th graders.